Good afternoon, everyone. So, the more you watch the experts and read the literature and understand what's going on with Ukraine and Russia, the more you realize that defeat in some way for Russia is likely inevitable. Now, whether that is returning to the 2014 borders, whether that is a complete loss of Crimea, I'm not sure. But the reality is Putin cannot outmatch the West, largely because this tactic of trying to outlast them is just not going to work for Russia. There's definite certainties in a couple of scenarios I want to talk about that will likely come about with what I'm calling Putin's complete clusterfuck here in Ukraine. Now, in a best case scenario for Putin, he would manage to present what is going to be a defeat in Ukraine as a win. This is what Khrushchev did after the Cuban Missile Crisis, although that wasn't necessarily as much of a defeat as it was a compromise, but to the Russians it could have been seen as a defeat. Regardless, he presented it as a win. More precisely, it could take a page, Putin could take a page from Saddam Hussein in that after presenting a pitiful loss and withdrawal from Kuwait, he somehow painted it as a win to the Iraqi people, and they bought it. This could happen to the Russians, and it probably will in some sense, but he's going to have a harder time convincing the Russian population than Khrushchev did the Soviets because the Soviet Union was far more isolated. The Russian population still has ties to the outside world through the internet, which didn't exist in great capacity like it does now back during the Soviet Union, or even when Saddam Hussein was defeated after the Gulf War. So that will erode the base of propaganda for Putin as it does every day. Not to mention some 500,000 people have left Russia. They still have contact with their family and friends back in Russia and are telling the more precise truth. They are telling what is going on, and these are the best and brightest often from their various sectors within that country. And because of that, they have the credibility backing with them to try and fight back against the Kremlin. The problem is they're not there, so it's long distance. So he's going to have a hard time convincing the Russian public that this is a win. So, like I said, there's three certainties that I want to talk about. The first is an easy one. The country is separating from Europe completely. They're not going to have any ties to Europe. This is going to be a problem for more cosmopolitan type cities like St. Petersburg, who enjoyed their more Europeanized and Western lifestyles that have been fostered for the last 3 decades. That's going away, and that's going to be a problem for Putin. He's going to have to find a way to replace that with something, and Putin just doesn't have the ass end in the technological capability of Russia to match. I mean, you just can't get an iPhone in Russia anymore, basically. So that is the first certainty, and that's the relatively minor one. The second one is that by the mid-2020s, the country is going to be so undermined by sanctions and its demographic weakening that it could conceivably have an economic collapse completely. This is largely because no one's buying their oil. China's not buying it because there's really no infrastructure to get it to them, and any kind of infrastructure buildup requires Western technology that they don't have access to, but also requires China to be willing to buy it en masse without incurring the wrath of the United States and Europe. They have shown that they don't want to do that, given that China relies on the US and Europe as its sugar daddy, basically, to pay everything. So Russia just doesn't have enough money to prop up China in any kind of meaningful way. Demographic weakening. They were already not reaching replacement population within Russia. They were having too few kids already. 500,000 plus people have fled the country. Another 100,000 have died in this war. This demographic problem is going to cause an economic collapse, period. That's just going to happen. It may not happen next year, but by the end of this decade, it will. Now, the third certainty is Russia will likely enter a period of very troubled, hard times directly related to this war. And it's happened before. This would be the 4th time it's happened to Russia. 1905, 1917, and 1989 were all examples of when Russia had economic and military trouble after a failed operation. Now, this leads to some scenarios. Now, the first scenario, and the one we all hope for, is that of Germany after 1945, in which There's a general reconciliation. There's introspection within the Russian people. They recognize their problems. They begin to heal, join the Western world, and we all go off into the setting sun, hand in hand, doing better. Problem is Russia is not Germany. Germany had a pre-established non-commodity driven economy. They were manufacturing based, so they could rely on something. Russia doesn't necessarily have that. They're experts in really nothing other than giving oil to people. Also, Germany, if you've ever been there, and I have, I lived there for 3 years, they very much like the rule of law. Russia does not. Because of this, there will be no Nuremberg trials in Russia. There will be no accountability, and the country will not have some sort of benefactor over watching them like Germany did with the US, Britain, France, etc., to try and bring them back. They just won't happen in Russia. More than likely, what Russia is going to have take place is the second scenario, which is North Korea. It's going to isolate. It's going to radicalize. It's going to internalize and cut itself off from the rest of the community. And Putin and his successors will continue to keep the country in some sort of conflict, war, fighting terrorism, fighting something, so that they can galvanize the population to make sure that to make the population think that the whole world's going to end if we don't follow our great leader, Putin. Sound familiar? It's North Korea. And that's what we kind of are looking at. That's probably the most likely scenario, because Putin has built up enough political capital and strength surrounding him that there's really no way to undermine him. It'll likely the only time we'll see any kind of waves potentially is when Putin dies, however that may come. Now, there's a third worst scenario, and this is really ugly. It would be like Somalia. So Somalia is a country whose only saving grace is its resources, such as oil. Sound familiar? That's all Russia has too. Could Russia fall into the state of Somalia in the 1990s, in which militias and gangs would rule across the country? Various factions, such as the Chechens or the Tatars or the Mongols, could potentially stand up and push back against the Kremlin in civil war situations. And you think I'm exaggerating. Well, not really, when you realize that after the past 10 years, Russia's best and brightest, like I said, have left. And so it's left to kind of this lower middle class situation, which has become more criminalized. I had a tickle in my throat there. So anyways, these kind of criminal factions and also the smaller minority republics, such as the Buryats or the Tuvans, are already starting to show dissent against the Kremlin because they've been disproportionately affected by the war, both economically and as a share of the Russian army. And because of this, they're starting to question Putin's motives on a total Russia here. And this isn't to say that necessarily there will be some sort of religious outcome, but often these are the Muslim countries. And they won't stand for what is happening if they are seeing a disproportionate Muslim negative effect on them. And this has been proven time and again, not only in Russia, but in most countries within Middle East, etc. So the reality is great empires don't fall gracefully. And this was spoke by the U.S. ambassador in 1991. And he's not wrong. The reality is Russia has little reason to rejoice, and really the world. We don't want to see suffering in Russia. We don't want to see this take place because of the whims of a mad dictator, which is what Putin has become. But the reality is, the writing's on the wall. These things are going to happen. And the best case scenario for Russia at this point would be to take the German approach, but at worst, we may see Somalia, but more than likely, we're going to see a large Iron Curtain go up, and Russia is going to become the next large North Korea, unfortunately.